Key text messages between European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and French President Emmanuel Macron have vanished, sparking a political firestorm that threatens to engulf the European Union in a crisis of its own making. The decision to delete these communications has ignited grave concerns about a fundamental lack of transparency at the very heart of the EU's decision-making processes, raising the specter of what some are calling a transparency collapse. This incident, revolving around the appointment of a crucial health official during a global pandemic, is far more than a simple case of deleted data. It cuts to the core of the EU's professed values of openness and accountability. The fallout from these vanished messages exposes serious, systemic flaws in the principles that are supposed to underpin the European Union, suggesting a culture where powerful leaders may operate beyond the reach of public scrutiny. The implications are profound, calling into question the integrity of the institutions that govern over 400 million citizens, and shaking the foundations of public trust at a time when it is needed most. Filed requests to access text messages exchanged between Ms. von der Leyen and Mr. Macron. These communications were directly related to the 2020 appointment of Emer Cooke as the new Director General of the European Medicines Agency, EMA, the powerful body responsible for approving vaccines and treatments for the entire bloc. Given that this appointment occurred at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, the public interest in the selection process was exceptionally high. However, what should have been a routine transparency request quickly spiraled into a major political scandal. Subsequent investigations by watchdogs and inquiries from members of the European Parliament revealed a startling fact. The messages in question no longer existed. They had been deliberately deleted from the mobile devices of both the Commission President and the French President. This act of digital erasure immediately set off alarm bells across the European political landscape, transforming a procedural inquiry into a full-blown controversy about secrecy and influence at the highest echelons of EU power. The timing and context of the appointment made the missing messages particularly sensitive, leading critics to question what information the two leaders felt was so necessary to conceal from public view. In response to the growing outcry, the European Commission attempted to downplay the significance of the deletions. In an official statement, a spokesperson characterized the removal of the messages as a standard procedure for the mobile devices used by high-ranking officials. The Commission's defense rested on the claim that any important information contained within those texts, such as official documents or substantive policy discussions, would have been properly recorded by other means and preserved through official channels. This explanation sought to frame the issue as a matter of routine digital hygiene rather than an intentional act of obscuring a sensitive political negotiation. The argument presented was that short-lived and informal communications, like text messages, are not typically considered official EU documents that require archiving, unless they contain substantive information that is then transferred into the Commission's record-keeping systems. However, this line of reasoning failed to address the central concern. Without the original messages, it is impossible for independent observers, journalists, or oversight bodies to verify whether their content was indeed trivial, or conversely, if it constituted an inappropriate or undisclosed lobbying effort that influenced a critical appointment. The Commission's seemingly dismissive response only served to deepen the skepticism surrounding the incident. This official explanation was met with immediate and forceful opposition from a broad coalition of lawmakers within the European Parliament. Members from centrist and progressive groups, most notably the Renew Europe group, to which Macron's own party is allied, and the Greens' European Free Alliance, rejected the Commission's justification as wholly inadequate and deeply troubling. They argued that the deliberate deletion of these messages, regardless of the stated procedure, effectively obstructs the fundamental right of the public and supervisory bodies to access information and hold their leaders accountable. Sophie 't Veld, a prominent Dutch MEP from the Renew Europe group and a longtime advocate for transparency, has been particularly scathing in her criticism, describing the situation as symptomatic of a culture of impunity. Text messages and other instant messaging platforms are frequently used for substantive political discussions and negotiations. To arbitrarily declare them outside the scope of transparency rules creates a dangerous loophole that allows powerful officials to conduct sensitive business in the shadows, far from public oversight. The backlash from within the parliament was swift and decisive. In a significant move, the European Parliament's Budget Control Committee formally requested that the relevant EU authorities, including the European Ombudsman and the European Public Prosecutor's Office, launch a full investigation into the incident. The objective of this investigation is to determine whether the deletion of the messages constitutes a breach of the EU's own ethical guidelines, transparency regulations, and data retention laws. This formal request for an inquiry has elevated the matter from a political dispute to a potential legal and ethical crisis, putting the Commission and the French government under intense pressure to provide more credible answers. The Parliament's firm stance underscores a growing divide between the EU's executive and legislative branches over the principles of openness and accountability. This incident, while centered on a specific set of deleted messages, penetrates deep into the core of the European Union's power structure and its operational ethos. It is not merely a technical issue of data management, but a political issue that touches upon the fundamental legitimacy of the EU project. The deliberate erasure of communications between two of the most powerful leaders in Europe concerning a high-stakes appointment inevitably raises strong suspicions of secret agreements or clandestine, informal exchanges that may have unduly influenced a crucial decision. This runs directly contrary to the principle of transparency that the EU has long proclaimed as one of its foundational values. The very possibility that major appointments could be decided through off-the-record text message exchanges, which are then conveniently erased, strikes at the heart of democratic governance. Furthermore, the incident severely undermines the concept of accountability. When top officials are unable or unwilling to produce the direct records of their communications, it becomes nearly impossible for the public, the press, or even the European Parliament to hold them responsible for their actions. This creates an accountability vacuum where power can be exercised without consequence. The scandal also casts a harsh spotlight on the glaring loopholes in the EU's existing regulations for the storage and management of official communications. It reveals that the rules have not kept pace with modern technology, particularly the widespread use of personal mobile devices and encrypted instant messaging applications like WhatsApp or Signal for official business. This regulatory gap allows for a two-tiered system of information, one that is official, archived, and accessible, and another that is informal, ephemeral, and hidden from view. The consequences of this transparency collapse are already beginning to ripple across the Union. It's threatening to inflict lasting damage on the relationship between EU institutions and the citizens they serve. The most immediate and significant consequence is the potential for a severe erosion of public trust. At a time when the EU is confronting a multitude of complex challenges, from the war in Ukraine to economic instability and the climate crisis, maintaining public confidence in the integrity and fairness of its institutions is paramount. Incidents like this, which create the perception of an unaccountable elite operating by a different set of rules, can be incredibly corrosive to that trust. It feeds into populist narratives that portray Brussels as a remote and secretive bureaucracy, further alienating citizens and weakening the fabric of European unity. In response, transparency advocates and a growing number of European parliamentarians are intensifying. They are demanding a radical overhaul of the rules governing data storage. Specifically, they are pushing for new regulations that would explicitly cover all forms of communication used for official business, including text messages and instant messages, regardless of the device used. The pressure is mounting to close the existing loopholes and establish a clear, legally binding framework that ensures all substantive discussions by EU officials are recorded and accessible. The sensitivity of this particular incident is magnified by the central role of the European Medicines Agency. The appointment of Emer Cooke to lead Europe's most important public health authority during a global pandemic was a decision of immense public consequence. The suggestion that this process may have been influenced by back-channel dealings compromises not only the integrity of the appointment, but also the credibility of the IMA itself. This episode of the Vanishing Messages serves as an urgent and resounding wake-up call for the European Union. It starkly illustrates the critical need to reinforce and modernize the mechanisms that ensure transparency and accountability at the highest levels of power. It is a moment that demands more than just bureaucratic clarifications or procedural tweaks. It calls for a genuine recommitment to the principle that important decisions must not only be made in the public interest, but must also be seen to be made in a manner that is open, public, and subject to rigorous scrutiny. The path forward requires tangible reforms that will guarantee that the workings of the EU are not shrouded in digital fog, but are clear and accessible to the citizens in whose name its leaders govern. The future legitimacy of the European project may very well depend on it.